Hello and welcome to video 2 of our literature course video series. My name is Chris. I was one of the teachers for this course, along with Jiashu for this module, so analytical writing. And in this second video, we'll be adding on to Jiashu's first series by talking on to a new topic, which is, of course, analysis of visual courses, or visual sources, thank you all for joining us, and I guess we can get right into it. All right, so when it comes to analysis of visual sources, ultimately, I chose to break it down into four major steps, four things that I think you need to keep in mind. The first, of course, is the most basic when it comes to any sort of analytical writing or any sort of analytical work. And it's just, of course, starting with the borderline, what you see. So, like the sort of obvious things. What key elements, objects, or words are obvious or visible within the visual that you're trying to look at, and why are they significant? Right? So, consider what the author might be trying to emphasize and why that might be the case. So if they were, for example, put something in the very middle and made it the focal point of the picture, it's probably pretty important. And now ask yourself, why is it important? Why is it in the middle? And what does the object actually mean? Also, if it's a visual thing, you might see some graphic novel elements, speech bubbles, labels, the gutters, whole bunch of different things. They all have meaning, so don't forget about them. And ultimately, ask how all these things suggest, or what they suggest about the context, the mood, the atmosphere, even the meaning of the text, which is synonymous with picture in this case. Now, when it comes down to this meaning, now this is where it leads on to our second step, which is, of course, individual connections and significance. So obviously, you want to link objects that you just identified from the source to certain themes or topics that you have learned or are familiar with, things that make up your interpretation. So these are the types of moves that you as an analytical writer always need to do. So always need to think about this when you're doing analytical writing of any sort. So also consider things like, is it a symbol? Remember, the symbols are only significant because we make them significant, whether it be as a society, so we can commonly agree things like hearts mean love, but also, I guess, as the reader or as the audience to the author. Like the author sometimes will work really hard to make certain symbols mean something in the context of the text itself. And it really just is really, really important that you can identify that and talk about that if it is like a large part of the author's work. Because I mean, if you do miss something like a very, very important symbol, even if you do understand its significance and you do get what it means, if you don't explicitly say it, well, in terms of marking, the teacher can't really know if you do understand that, and you will lose like easy marks, or you could lose easy marks, which is never something you want to do. Um, of course, though, I mean, obviously, you can also consider if these things are representative of something or if they convey a message. The biggest warning I will give in this case, though, is to make sure that your relationships and your connections, they are backed up by evidence. So, I mean, this can be obvious. So it can be really easy to say that, yeah, once again, a heart means love, but it can also be like less obvious. But then, of course, if it is less obvious, then you have to put in the work to go from point A to point B all the way to point C, right? Otherwise, it can get cloudy, it can get a bit confusing, and that's never really something you want to convey to the person reading your analysis. Given that, though, let's move on to steps 3 and 4. So step 3, of course, is relating it to a bigger picture or an overarching theme. So now you've made some connections, bring it home, tie all at one huge, most significant theme for you. And so this, of course, begs a few questions. So first of all, what is the author trying to communicate? What does the image actually suggest? And what is the author's message? So remember, you can't actually know what the author is trying to say, obviously, because you haven't asked what the author was intending to do. So all you can really write about is how you felt, what you thought as the audience. So talk about your interpretation, make sure you take ownership of it. But also, though, even when you're taking your own interpretation, as truthful as it may be, like you might have had the most vivid emotional response, you can't write about that unless you can actually reference objects in the picture, right? If it just randomly reminded you of a childhood experience, but it's not reflected at all in the actual parts of the picture, well, I'm sorry, but it doesn't really work well for analytical work. Rather, you have to make sure whatever interpretation you do champion, whatever interpretation you do choose, you can find specific objects, which is your evidence in this case, in the picture to reference. Likewise, when it comes once again to these universally recognized connotations, these common symbols, we'll make sure that if it is common, well, you still explain it, even though you have to go very deep. But if it's less common, you have to put in the work. And obviously, in this case, if it's too abstract, too extreme, consider not necessarily using that specific symbol, object, or theme. For example, if you're going to connect a heart to love, once again, very simple, but to say something like, oh, the random soda bottle that you saw on the street randomly in the picture, which is very much in the corner, very, very small and very insignificant. If you're saying that this suddenly makes the entire text a certain hit piece on the predatory nature of modern capitalism or something of that sort, that's a bit of a stretch, right? That's a little bit extreme. And I mean, it's a lot, it's much, much harder to sort of like argue. And also, because you have to go that much further in arguing it, it makes your text a lot less concise, which usually is a bad thing. So obviously, don't totally avoid it. You could make a good text from it. Like, don't get me wrong. It's just it's usually easier to stay simple. Don't go too simple, obviously, but just stay a bit simpler. Keep things solid, easy to I guess easy to support, and don't read too far between the lines. Now, if you really really want to challenge yourself and go that last bit further, consider the actual context of the picture. And this can go for any text, to be honest. And so when it comes to a picture, consider what time period the picture was created. So the historical context and what was going on at the time. So the example I'll give is, I guess, The Great Gatsby, which is one of my favorite books. It was written in 1924, which is in the middle of the Roaring Twenties. And if anyone who has read The Great Gatsby will know, well, that actually makes sense based on what The Great Gatsby is actually talking about. It critiques the huge disparity between the rich and the poor, how the rich live such lavish lifestyles while the poor are literally dying because of their work. Well, this is the sort of thing that makes sense given the time period that F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote the text in. So consider this when you're writing, consider when you're looking at certain texts. And it's always a good idea to add that certain level of credibility to ground your analysis in something that actually happens. Because it makes sense, right? Whether or not we actually intend for it to happen, when we write or when we read or when we speak, we're always influenced by what's happening in our time period. Um, Other than that, I guess those are the four main steps. Hopefully, it does help you a bit. Here is a picture for you to consider. It was actually published during the French Revolution. So anyone who knows a little bit of history about the French Revolution would kind of see where it's coming from. And yeah, if you want to give it a try, I would challenge you to try some visual analysis on this picture. It's always some good practice. And of course, as with anything, the best way to get better is to practice. But for me, that's it. That's my part of the video. I'm so glad that you guys watched and stayed through it. And I guess stay tuned for our next videos. So yeah, take care.